Thank you very much, Scott. It is great to see so many old friends out here and so many new people who've come to join us. Last night, we had a group discussion in here about the state of the economy. And while we were sitting here, it looked like this when we came in. And then all of a sudden, the wind kicked up and it started raining really hard. And I looked around and I said, "What happened?" And somebody said, "Well, Scott just walked in." So we know who's in charge around here. It is my honor to introduce Governor Chris Waller from the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. Justin I don't see him. Coach Knight is not here, is he? Because I was going to say, Chris started his career as a professor at the University of Indiana, so he would have had something in common. And then, because he's an economist with two hands, he moved to the University of Kentucky, so he could, always have a winner going on there. And he's had a number of other academic posts and ended up as the research director at the St. Louis Fed. And then a couple of years ago, he was nominated by then President Donald Trump to the Federal Reserve Board. Took a very long time to get through the politics of Washington. I can't blame Paul because he's on the House side, but we finally got him through, and he is now one of the 7 members of the board. They just confirmed Michael Barr as the latest governor yesterday, and it is the first time since 2013 that the Fed has had a full complement of governors. So we're expecting great things now that you have the whole team put together. I'll call Chris up and just mention that, and I have the same problem when people ask me, where did I go to school? He got a master's and PhD from Washington State, but his undergraduate work was at Bemidji State, and he got a BS in economics. And people tend to think that economists are full of BS. So I will bring up Chris now, and he will let us know his feelings on the state of the economy. Chris Waller.
Well, good morning. I'm a little more dressed than the rest of you. I just want to take a minute. Yesterday was a bad day in terms of economic news with the CPI that came in. I also, when I got back from dinner last night, got word that one of my oldest and dearest friends passed away. So, yeah, I just wanted to take a moment and say his name was Bertold Herrendorf. He was an economics professor at Arizona State. I knew the guy for 35 plus years. And it was a very sad loss for me. So I don't know if it's normal or ethical or even legal, but I'm going to dedicate this speech to him. So thank you, Mike, and thank you to the Global Interdependence Center for the invitation to speak to you today. Let me start at the place that all remarks about U.S. monetary policy should start, which is with the Federal Reserve's dual mandate of maximum employment and price stability. As I discussed below, we have a very strong labor market with an unemployment rate that is below the median of policymakers' expected long-run level, and high inflation that is far above target. We are achieving our mandate when it comes to maximum employment, but we are far from achieving our goal of stable prices. Consequently, while any monetary policy decision has implications for achieving maximum employment, and I will address those implications in a moment, the FOMC is now and must be utterly focused on moving inflation down towards our 2% target. We must be focused on reducing inflation because despite a lot of talk about recession lately, the evidence from the labor market indicates the economy is on track, while inflation continues to be far too high. It must be our focus because high inflation is the biggest challenge to sustaining our employment goal and the greatest burden for individuals and families, especially lower and moderate income households that dedicate a larger share of their spending to necessities. Inflation has to be our focus at every morning meeting and every day because the spending and pricing decisions people and businesses make every day depend on their expectations of future inflation, which in turn depends on whether they believe the Fed is sufficiently committed to achieving our inflation target. So let me be clear. I'm going to vote to set policy in a manner that will reduce inflation and achieve our price stability goal. And today I will explain why I don't see that progress conflicting with our maximum employment goal. Let me start with my view of labor markets and inflation, and then turn to the implications for monetary policy and conclude with where I think the economy is headed. So we have a puzzle. As many economists are discussing, recent economic data have created a puzzle. The labor market continues to be very strong, but the real economy seems to be faltering. So how can GDP, which is a measure of our nation's total output produced, fall in the first half of 2022 while the economy created 2.7 million jobs? These two things just don't go together. Hire more people to produce, but your output fell. So this raises a question that we've all been grappling with: is the labor market not as strong as it appears, or is the economy doing better than the data suggest? So to assess the strength of the labor market, there are numerous indicators of its health, and sometimes they point in different directions. Today is not one of those days. Based on every major labor market indicator, the labor market is very strong and in historical terms, very tight. The timeliest evidence for this strength was the jobs report that came out last Friday for the month of June, which found that the economy created 372,000 jobs. These are amazing numbers when you look back in time. Now, I will admit my vision isn't what it used to be, but with revisions to May and April, it's hard to see any slowing in the pace of monthly job creation since February. There were 398,000 jobs created in March, then 368,000 in April, 384 in May, 372 in June. So in the first half of 2022, the economy has created 2.7 million jobs. That isn't a picture of a weakening labor market. The unemployment rate in June was steady at 3.6%. It is often said that this is close to a half-century low, and that's true, but you really have to go back 69 years to 1953 to find the unemployment rate more than a couple of tenths below where we are now. So this is about as good as a job market as any worker has ever seen. The June job report is consistent with other labor market indicators. Job vacancies, an indicator I have highlighted in some past speeches, are unprecedentedly high. There are nearly 2 jobs available for every person looking for a job. Historically, it's the reverse. There's 1 job for every 2 workers looking. Job postings measured by the Labor Department for May and by Indeed for June have fallen a bit in recent months, but are still historically at high levels, consistent with a very tight labor market. As the share of the labor force, weekly initial claims for unemployment insurance are still near record lows and have been fairly steady, although today's number popped up a little bit. Businesses continue to report that jobs are plentiful, and small business owners say that jobs are very hard to fill. So looking more broadly across 24 different labor market metrics summarized by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, we see that activity is above its pre-pandemic level, which was a very good job. And the Atlanta Fed's labor market distribution spider chart shows that the vast majority of labor market indicators are about as tight or tighter than they were before the pandemic. So the broad range of data showing a very strong labor market indicates to me that this isn't a measurement issue about the labor market. So let's turn to GDP. So there's signs that GDP is slowing in economic activity. The Commerce Department estimates that there was a modest contraction, actually falling output in real GDP for the first quarter of this year. And now casting projections, which are often done by forecasters to try to guess what the next number will be, such as the Atlanta Fed's GDP Now tracker, they foresee a similar contraction for the second quarter. Now, 2 quarters of negative GDP growth is a rule of thumb for a recession. There's also some softness in recent spending data, which has been widespread across consumer spending, business investment, housing, and government purchases, as well as some weaker indicators for the manufacturing sector and a deterioration in consumer sentiment, which by some measures are at historically low levels. And as I said, some have already argued that a recession has started, which for me as a professional economist for 40 years telling me we're in a recession and unemployment is 3.6%. Something doesn't square. So that's it. I don't see how that squares with the job creation data, the low unemployment rate, and overall strong labor market I described later. In addition to the contrasting evidence in the labor market, there are several other reasons why I'm very cautious about acting on the GDP estimates and on projections of an output slowdown. One is that while first quarter real GDP is now estimated to have shrunk by 1.6%, according to another estimate, real domestic income, GDI, increased by 1.8%. Now, these two things are supposed to be the same. If I sell you some output for $10 and you give me $10, you got $10 of output, I got $10 of income. The numbers have to be the same, just it's counting. Now, there's always some measurement stuff, but there's a huge difference now between GDP and GDI. And this has happened in the past. So, and when they go back and revise the data, they tend to bring them together. So you've got GDI growing at 1.8, GDP falling at minus 1.5. There's a good chance these things get averaged out somewhere around zero. Now, we also know that there were some unusual trade-related reasons for the low GDP number in the first quarter that are unlikely to be repeated. And revisions in both GDP and GDI could largely erase this contraction in output. And the data that point to some slowing don't convince me that it'll damage the labor market. Measures of manufacturing activity and indicators of future activity, such as the Purchasing Manager Index, they have moderated, but they're still in expansionary territory. Rather than a recession, the softening data seem consistent with the pandemic-related transition underway since last year among consumers from spending on goods to spending on services. And we should expect that as policy tightening feeds through the economy, it will dampen household and business spending decisions. That is the whole objective of our tightening. Past experience has shown that job creation and the unemployment rate are timely indicators of a recession, more timely than quarterly GDP. So I will watch all the data carefully, but the factors I just cited, along with the evident strength across different measures of the labor market, leave me feeling fairly confident the U.S. economy did not end of 2022, and that economic expansion will continue in the later half of this year. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, inflation. Yesterday's report on the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, was a major league disappointment. On a 12-month basis, total inflation stood at 9.1%, the highest in 40 years. Core inflation, which excludes energy and food, which came down slightly in the last couple months, has averaged over 6% this year. Our target is at 2%. And that is just too high as well. So no matter how you look at the inflation data, it's far too high, and my job is to move it down toward our 2% target. Now, we know that supply shortages and bottlenecks, including a tight labor market, have contributed to the high inflation readings we are observing. We also know that the surge in demand during the pandemic that was driven by excess saving, significant fiscal stimulus, and accommodative monetary policy also contributed to high inflation we are now experiencing. There is some research estimating how much of this inflation comes from supply problems and how much comes from high demand. The main point of this research is that both have played a large part in driving inflation that we have seen over the past year. But the causes of inflation, whether it's supply or demand, don't affect my approach to policy. Because in writing the FOMC's mandate, Congress did not say your goal is price stability unless inflation is caused by supply shocks. Then you're off the hook. That's not what they wrote. We want to reduce excess inflation, whatever the source, in part because whether it comes from supply or demand, high inflation can push up longer run inflation expectations and thus affect spending and pricing decisions in the near term. These decisions can then push up prices even more and make inflation even harder to control. Now, I pay attention to both surveys, the public's inflation expectations, and measures of inflation expectations derived from trading of inflation index securities. Now, I prefer the latter market-based measures, which are down from recent peaks, but still elevated. The board staff combines various surveys and market-based measured in our index of common inflation expectations, which has moved up slightly in recent months after being flat for a long time. So we need to avoid expectations rising so much that they become a factor in driving inflation even higher. So based on persistently high inflation and the very tight labor market that I have described, let's talk about the implications for monetary policy. Since March, the FOMC has raised the federal funds rate, that's our policy rate, 3 times for a cumulative 150 basis points or 1.5 percentage points. This is the fastest pace of tightening in close to 30 years. At our last meeting, we raised the policy rate by 75 basis points or 0.75%. That size increase, by the way, that's a large move by historical standards. That size increase was not, I want to stress this, it was not an overreaction to one data point on inflation. It was primarily the response to a sequence of excessively high inflation readings since the beginning of the year. So it was appropriate given the lack of progress on inflation and clearly signals the FOMC's commitment to get inflation under control as soon as possible. Now, the response of financial markets to the FOMC's policy actions and communications indicate to me that the committee retains the credibility and the public confidence that is needed to make monetary policy effective. Longer-term interest rates have moved up to levels not far from those reflected in the committee members' estimates of the final destination for the Fed funds rate in this tightening cycle, effectively implementing policy ahead of time. The average rate for a 30-year conforming fixed rate home mortgage has increased by more than 200 basis points, 2 full percentage points since the end of 2021. Now, while there is some slowdown in home sales, lenders and borrowers are still doing business at these rates, which indicates that they believe the FOMC's policy intentions are credible, as broadly reflected in the interest rate pass and the summary of economic projections, which I'll refer to as SEP later. As I have said before, with inflation so high, there's a virtue in front-loading tightening so that policy moves as soon as practical to a setting that starts restricting demand. Getting there sooner will bolster the public's confidence that we can get inflation down, and it will preserve options for adjusting the pace of tightening later if needed. So with this view, it should not be surprising that looking forward to the FOMC's next meeting on July 26th and 27th, and with yesterday's CPI data in hand, I fully support another 75 basis point increase, bringing the target range for the federal funds from 2.25% to 2.5% before August. I judge that level is close to neutral, by which I mean the level that neither stimulates nor restricts demand. And assuming that the economy is growing moderately or at its potential and the unemployment rate is roughly where it is now. However, my base case for July depends on incoming data. We have important data releases on retail sales and housing and inflation expectations coming in before the next meeting. If that data come in materially stronger than expected, it would make me lean towards a larger hike at the July meeting, to the extent that that data shows demand is not slowing down fast enough to get inflation down. Based on what we know about inflation today, I expect that further increases in the target range will be needed to make monetary policy restrictive. But that will depend on economic data coming in weeks and months. Between the end of July and the FOMC September meeting, we get 2 employment reports, 2 CPI reports, PCE inflation reports, and data for July and August. I'll be looking for signs that inflation has started to move down toward our 2% target on a sustained basis. I anticipate a decline in inflation will come as actual and anticipated hikes by the FOMC cool demand for products and labor, which will help bring demand and supply back into better balance. The decline in the rate of inflation will also be assisted by continued improvement in goods supply bottlenecks, which is occurring in some sectors, and an increase in labor force participation, which is still significantly lower than before the pandemic. I hope these supplier recoveries happen, but my expectations for policy do not rely on it. I expect rate increases will continue after July at a pace dependent on the incoming data. After the July meeting, further increases will be restricting demand because they will be pushing the rate above what I think of as neutral. Looking further in the future, I will need to see how the tightening this year is affecting the economy and bringing inflation down toward our 2% target. Based on my forecast for the economy, I expect monetary policy to be restrictive until there has been a sustained reduction in core personal consumption expenditure, or PCE inflation, which excludes food and energy. Food and energy tend to be volatile. So it's not that we don't care about food and energy. It's just when we think about inflation going forward, food and energy do not give us good indicators. So we kind of take those away for a forecasting tool. So importantly, as futures prices for commodities, food, energy, raw materials, they have declined recently. I'm expecting total PCE inflation to decline in coming months. But until I see a significant moderation in core PCE prices, I support further rate hikes. In talking about where monetary policy is headed, it's helpful to get a fix on where it is now. So I mentioned earlier this concept of a neutral interest rate and the belief that the federal funds rate will be close to neutral after another 75 basis point increase at the end of this month. Now, some would argue that monetary policy is actually far away from neutral based on the fact that current inflation is so much higher than the Fed funds rate. In my view, that rests on a flawed idea of how monetary policy affects spending decisions. That's because your spending decisions that require borrowing are based on an outlook that extends years into the future. So this means you want to look at what markets are pricing real rates are in the future, not some contemporaneous ex post rate today. This means taking into consideration longer term real rates, which are tied to the expected path of policy and expected inflation over the next several years. As a result, I think that estimates of the real federal funds rate should be based on expected policy rate 1 to 1.5 years from now. Based on trading in inflation index treasury securities of different maturities compared to nominal treasury securities, investors see federal funds rates above expected inflation starting about 6 months from now and steepening thereafter. Primary security dealers surveyed by the New York Fed likewise estimate the real federal funds rate will be a positive 0.7% in mid-2023 and 1% by mid-2024. This gives me some confidence that tightening now, the tightening now anticipated by markets and expected by FOMC participants will be sufficient to reduce demand and inflation. The FOMC's plan for getting inflation under control depends on a view of the economic outlook. As I've noted in past speeches, accurate economic forecasting is very hard, especially when unusual factors like a war and unprecedented factors like a pandemic buffet the global economy. FOMC participants record their individual outlooks that are presented every 3 months in the Survey of Economic Projections. At our June meeting, the latest SEP shows that there is some expectation among participants for what is known as a soft landing. With a policy path like what I described for this year and a bit more tightening next year, the median SEP respondent projected the current PCE inflation is expected to fall from its current elevated level today to 2.2% in the fourth quarter of 2024. At the same time, the unemployment rate is projected to rise to 3.7% at the end of this year to 4.1% by the end of 2024, while GDP would grow below its long-run trend for the next 2 years, but not go into recession. So of course, we can't be very certain about the path of the economy more than a few months in the future, but this medium-term view of a soft landing is plausible. I say this based on the optimistic view that I expressed earlier about the strength of the labor market and on my analysis of the relationship between job vacancies and the unemployment rate. In a recent speech, I noted that we have a historically high number of job vacancies compared to the number of unemployed people. As I said, 2 to 1. Some people have argued that past experience indicates we cannot reduce this large number of vacancies without a big increase in unemployment. But I showed in that speech that past experience actually indicates that a reduction in vacancies can take place without a big loss of employment. Driving down labor demand, you can drive down vacancies and have a very moderate impact on unemployment. So while some data measures suggest the chances of a recession have increased, I believe it can be avoided. Now, uncertainty over how the pandemic could afflict the economy in the future and global economic risk related to the war in Ukraine are considerable. These factors could make future policy decisions more difficult than they are today. However, for the reasons I've laid out and considering the evidence on the state of the economy and the outlook, I don't find it difficult to reaffirm my strong conviction that continued policy tightening will be appropriate to move inflation down toward our 2% target. I think we need to move swiftly and decisively to get inflation falling in a sustained way, and then consider what further tightening will be needed to achieve our dual mandate. Thank you very much.
Are we on here? There we are. Okay. Thank you again. And welcome out to Victor, Idaho and the Rocky Mountain Economic Summit. I guess you didn't get the dress code memo.
No, I didn't. I had the wrong one. I got it from the central bank.
I actually think, and I think these people would probably agree, that if you were just like them when you went to the Fed, that would be more appropriate. Anyway,
I'm working on it.
We'd also like to welcome everybody who is watching the live stream of this event, both from the GIC and on the Bloomberg. And we will be joining Bloomberg Television Live in a short period of time and Bloomberg Radio to broadcast these remarks to the world. So we thank you for making the time for us. I want to start with a sort of simple definitional question, just so that everybody can understand what we're talking about. You're very upset because the CPI is at 9.1%, but the PCE is the number that you guys follow, and it's at 6.3%. I wonder if you could explain the difference to the audience here.
Yeah, so the CPI, so we all have kind of different bundles of goods that we all buy. And what matters for each of us is how much do we spend on each of those goods? We call those expenditure shares. In the CPI, they put a very large weight on shelter expense. Over a third of the CPI is on shelter. The PCE has a much lower, it's about 18 or 19% is the weight on shelter. So that's a big factor in the differences. There's also a significant difference in how medical costs are measured. So the CPI has often been thought of as overstating inflation because it puts such a high weight on inflation. I don't necessarily agree. If you look at low and moderate income households, those weights are about what they're spending their income on. They spend a lot of money on shelter, a lot of money on food and energy. So I often like to say, look, I like to look at the CPI because one, it's a measure of inflation we've had for decades and decades, but it's also probably a better index of what low and moderate income, that the weights in their basket compared to, say, my own. But we've chosen to look at PCE for this reason, so that housing doesn't create too big of a movement in inflation. And that's kind of what we're starting to see in the CPI after yesterday's report.
I know a lot of people here experience inflation the way I do. You go to the gas station and you look at the gas pump and you putting $100 into your tank. Why do you target or look more firmly at core when, as you just said, the actual expenditures that people make are on things like food and energy?
Yeah, so this is one thing I've kind of realized since I joined the board. There's kind of a misperception. We talk about headline inflation and core inflation, which throws out food and energy. Our target is headline PCE. We care about food and energy in your spending baskets when we try to figure out how to get inflation down. Core is what I was trying to say up there is we use core as a predictor of future inflation, because gas and food tend to be very volatile. They're not good predictors of future inflation. So that's why we toss it out. Not that we don't care. It's just they're not helping us predict future inflation. So if I can get you to think one thing, core is not that we throw it out because we don't care. We just toss it out to help us predict. That's all.
Which indicators are you watching? You said there's a bunch of data between now and the time you vote. Which ones will tell you what about the economy?
Well, we get retail sales on Friday, which is the strength of consumer spending. We had kind of a weak number last month, but there's a forecast that it should be reasonably good this next coming month. So, if you were in a recession, one of the things you would start seeing was consumer spending falling off. And so if we get a good retail report on Friday, I believe it's Friday, that just tells me that consumer demand is still strong and still there, and that we can keep tightening to try to pull things down.
The CFO of JP Morgan today said that they have not seen signs that inflation is causing consumers to pull back their discretionary spending. Does that jibe with what you're being told?
Well, that's what we'll see. I mean, last month, the retail sales were kind of weak, and a lot of it was thought of as inflation is starting to get people to pull back. They're having to put their spending into gas tanks, like you just said, as opposed to buying stuff in the retail sector. So we'll see. I mean, there's a large amount of excess savings still in bank accounts for U.S. households. Now, a lot of that is more heavily weighted to the upper half of the income distribution, but it's still there as a source of funding spending going forward.
Has that surprised you that spending has remained as strong as it has through all of the problems, issues that we've had?
Well, as I said, if you sit in your house for a year and can't spend on anything, you build up a lot of savings that you would normally have spent on services, travel, everything. And that money's just sitting there, independent of fiscal stimulus, independent of monetary policy. People were having all of this saving forced on them because they couldn't go out and spend it. Now they have the money and now they have the opportunity to spend it. The question is, how much of that will get spent down? Will we all go have a big party and blow it all in 1 year, or are we going to slowly stretch it out over a number of years? That's what we're waiting to see.
All right, what do you guys want? A party? Shall we do the party? I'd like to officially welcome everybody who is watching this on Bloomberg television around the world and listening to it on Bloomberg radio around the world. We're speaking with Christopher Waller, a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. You said in your speech that you favor 75 basis points and you would consider 100 given how the data comes in. This 100 idea just blew up this week after the CPI report. What would it take to get you from 75 to 100?
Well, like I said, 75 is my base case. We knew this inflation report was going to be ugly, and it was just uglier than we thought. So 75, which there was some concern was not going to happen, is now, in my view, should definitely happen. So what the report did yesterday for me was anchor that we are going to go, for me, I don't speak for the rest of the committee, but for myself, 75. Now, we don't want to make policy on one data point. That's kind of a critical thing. But this is another reading in a long sequence of very high inflation rates. And with the data on the real side economy showing this kind of, as I talked about, this kind of paradox that the real side looks to be softening, you're kind of in this thing, you don't want to really overdo the rate hikes. I mean, a 75 basis point hike, folks, is huge. Don't say because you're not going 100, you're not doing your job. So like I said, if I see the incoming data in the next 2 weeks coming in, showing me that demand is still really strong and robust, then I'm going to lean into a higher rate hike at this meeting.
Well, the counter argument is you said we want to get to neutral, and you're defining that as around 2.5%. And if you do 100, it gets you much closer to neutral, much faster. So why not just do it?
Yeah, for me, neutral is 2.25. The median for the committee is by the SEP is something like 225 to 250. For me, it's 2 to 225. So for me, a 75 basis rate hike gets us to my estimate of neutral. And then I'm thinking everyone after that is actual tightening on the economy. So it's really, we all have kind of this different view of exactly what neutral is. And that's kind of the problem with this concept of neutral. It's not some scientific thing. It's kind of we all have kind of a view of what it is, and it's all kind of similar. But yeah, for me, 75 gets us to neutral.
Well, a lot of people have been saying on the Fed 2 to 2.5 for neutral for years and years. Yeah. Now we've got inflation on the CPI measure at 9.1%, and we have the economy slowing. But a very strong labor market. Hasn't neutral moved up?
Yeah, so this is one of these. This is going to be a geeky answer, so I'm sorry. But the way I've often thought about neutral and the way the language came about is we kind of ask ourselves, if you were achieving both goals of your mandate, employment was right where you wanted it, inflation was exactly where you wanted it, what should the policy rate be? So when you hit the perfect nirvana, what's the interest rate? To me, that's what I think of as the neutral rate, because at that point, you would neither want to stimulate or contract the economy if you're achieving your goals. So that's kind of the concept of neutral I have in my head. It's not date dependent. If we achieved our objectives tomorrow, I would say we're hit neutral. That should be where you're at. So that's the concept. It's just that simple of a concept for me. And so I don't think it moves up and down a lot based on what the current CPI reads. That number is if I'm hitting my goals, where should I be?
There are a lot of people out there, especially Wall Street analysts, who suggest that a recession is all but inevitable at this point because the Fed has to put the economy into recession in order to break the back of inflation. I guess one of the analysts this morning in a report said the Fed would tolerate a mild recession. How do you feel about that?
So in order to, pull down inflation, we have to pull down total demand for goods, total demand for labor, to try to take price pressures off, wage pressures off. That's just what we have to do. I'm sorry. That's the job I was given by Congress. So the issue is, how much can you bring it down to push down inflation without causing too much damage on the real side of the economy, the quantities? So what I think is very plausible is we could have what's thought of as a growth recession, which is the growth rate falls below your kind of long run average, but it doesn't go negative. Typically a recession is it's negative for 2 quarters. So you could have slowing growth for 4 quarters, and that might be enough to get demand down, get inflation down without going into a full-blown recession. I still think that's possible.
Well, I forgot to mention earlier too that we have index cards out there that Jill has, and if you have questions, write down your questions and she will collect them and bring them up to me and we can get some of the audience feedback, because of course these guys have no opinions, whatever.
Just no tomatoes. That's all I think they don't have.
In the beige book, which is a sort of anecdotal account of the economy in the various Fed districts around the country, it came out Wednesday afternoon. They said in a number of districts, recession fears are really growing, particularly among CEOs. Do you think a recession is inevitable? How do you think about the possibility that we will contract? Is it, I know you say we can probably get there without it, but are we tilted in terms of the odds towards recession?
Yeah, like I said, that was kind of the punchline of the beginning part of my speech was we've got this conflicting data between the labor market and the real side of the economy. And I just have a very hard time from any economic model I know that you would add 2.7 million workers and your output goes down. That just makes me think, I mean, these people have negative productivity. They're making the existing workers worse. This can't be the case. So it's got to be something about the measuring of how they do this. And that's why we do revisions in the data over time. We get a flash estimate and then we collect more info over time. And then we say, well, maybe that wasn't the right number. That's the problem we have in policy. We have to make policy on real-time data. We don't get to wait 6 months to 12 months for the final revised numbers to come in. So I'm just, based on the labor market, I just don't see how, like I said, it just is inconceivable to have a recession with an unemployment rate of 3.6%.
So this has come up in conversations I've had with a number of people over the last couple of days, that Americans, according to the surveys that you watch, are extremely pessimistic about the economy, and by some measures, the lowest feeling ever. And the newspapers keep reporting, we're contracting in the economy, et cetera. Can we talk ourselves into recession?
Yeah, I mean, back to your CEO comment, I think a lot of it is analysts are trying to get ahead of the next move to get their positions in line for this, and then they start talking their book. And then that chatter starts making its way into corporate America and households. So it is kind of funny when you look at this household surveys, jobs are plentiful. You want a job, you can get one. I mean, you would think that this plus a lot of cushion in your bank accounts tells you, yeah, I'm in pretty good shape. But inflation is just destroying people's attitudes. They're watching their real wages go down. Like you said, you go to the gas pump and you watch your bank account empty into your car. That's no fun. I have the same problem as everybody else doing. So that's really it. I think that the negativeness is just the inflation, which we haven't seen in 40 years, is making people very pessimistic. And I'm fully sympathetic to it. I want to get it down.
You brought up a good point about Wall Street. Originally, Wall Street analysts were convinced Fed is way behind the curve. You got to raise rates a lot. And then it was the Fed is going to raise rates a lot. And so we're going to go into recession. So we should have sell everything. And then they were convinced that you'd have to start cutting rates. And then we're back to this week. You got to go really hard up 100 basis points. How much attention do you pay to what's going on both in the talk and in the market activities that happen on Wall Street?
Well, the talk matters to me in the sense that that talk gets priced into interest rates and other things that I care about in the financial markets. If I start seeing that, those interest rates start impacting the real economy. So in that sense, I do care about what they say. But in terms of predicting recessions, this is a very hard game. You're trying to predict a turning point in the economy. And anybody that does this for a living knows you always blow that point, right? Everybody predicts a recession after the fact. Very few actually get it right going forward. So, and same with expansions. So, I mean, people are thinking, we have to have a recession. I just don't see it. I don't see why that has to be the case. Recessions don't necessarily automatically follow from these things. And with this great labor market, the labor market would have to deteriorate incredibly fast to really, in my view, throw us into a recession.
Do you think there'll be, if you ended up going 100 basis points, do you think the markets are prepared for that? Or will we see a big sell-off, everybody's shocked because the Fed's decided the economy is so bad?
Well, I think the markets may have gotten ahead of themselves a little bit yesterday, that they just assumed it was going to go to 100 after that report. Market pricing has a probability of 100 basis point hike, I think around 70% this morning. I think that's kind of getting ahead of themselves. Like I said, we knew this was not going to be a good number. This was not a surprise. And 75 was my base case. And it kind of just confirmed it. So I looked at the CPI as it took what I had as a probability of 0.9 and made it 1. So that's what the CPI did for me yesterday. To go above that, I got to see a little more data in the next 2 weeks. And, you know, we just got this yesterday. And we don't want to make snap policy decisions based on some knee-jerk reaction to what happened in the CPI report. We want to be able to sit, talk to each other, talk this through, and then in 2 weeks, make what we think is the right group decision.
We have a question from the audience that is also on my list, so I'll go to that right away. We had Larry Summers, Olivier Blanchard, and one of their other co-authors put out a paper yesterday that says the inflation rate, the unemployment rate that would bring down inflation has moved up to 5%. How much unemployment is the Fed willing to tolerate? Do you think that's realistic, that you've got to push unemployment up to 5% to get inflation down?
Yeah, I heard about the paper. I haven't had a chance to look at it and read it. Some of my own analysis that I mentioned in a speech leads me to believe that you can lower vacancies. If you're going to drive down demand and you're looking for workers and it's 2 jobs for every worker, it seems to be the first thing that's going to fall off is want ads, right? You're not going to immediately say, oh, I'm going to fire all my workers too on top of it. It just seems like stop hiring, slow down hiring. You don't necessarily have to lay anybody off. That to me seems the natural logical progression is pulling down labor demand. Now, like I said, I haven't seen it, but if these, I'd have to sort of look and see exactly how they're coming up with these numbers. You know, I guess I'm just not going to comment on it since I haven't really seen it.
Well, unemployment, could it go that high? I mean, do we have a good handle on where unemployment's going to go?
You can always look at past recessions and get an idea how high it goes. I mean, I have right off the top of my head, I'd have to go to Fred, the data source at the St. Louis Fed, which I used to run. You know, if you go there and look, you know, I think if you looked at unemployment and it went to 5%, that would be pretty low for a recession in US history. So that wouldn't be, I don't want to say this word, but that wouldn't be too bad in a historical context, not my own personal social welfare view of life. It's just from a historical point of view, that would not be a bad a bad outcome.
We are talking with Fed Governor Christopher Waller, for those of you who are listening in on Bloomberg Radio around the world. The Fed and unemployment, your focus was on bringing it down. So how quickly do you pivot if it starts going up again?
I missed something. Say it again,
Your
Mike.
focus was on bringing unemployment down for a long time. Now you're focused on bringing inflation down, and as a consequence of that, it would push up unemployment. But so how quickly do you go back to the idea of bringing unemployment down? At what level of unemployment do you start to worry that you've gone too far?
Yeah, I mean, if you were sitting there as a central banker, inflation 6 to 9% and unemployment goes to 6 to 8%, this is your nightmare. Because now you're staring at very high unemployment, very high inflation, and you have to make a choice whether to attack one, the other, or just take it. And that was the problem in the 1970s that the Fed got into, was high inflation, high unemployment, and not being able to really figure out what to do with either goal. And then inflation just kept becoming entrenched in people's wage demands or minds or expectations. And inflation eventually got to the point where Volcker came in and said, look, I got to forget about the employment side and just get inflation down. And he crushed it. And it was a very expensive, very costly recession. I talked to Volcker about 10 years ago and I asked him this. I said, must have taken a lot of guts to do what you did, knowing what was going to happen. He said, if I had known what was going to happen, I never would have done it. But once I did it, I couldn't stop. I had to carry it out. So that's really it. I mean, if you don't get inflation down, it's going to cause problems all by itself. I said this last week at a NABE conference, but I have always used inflation as a tax on economic activity. Just think of your income, the purchasing power of your wage, your bank. That's a tax when you can't buy as much because of inflation. So inflation is a negative impact on economic output all by itself. And if you don't get it under control, it's going to cause all sorts of damage going forward. So that's why we got to get this down.
We have a couple of questions along the same lines, and so I will sort of combine them. There are obviously people who are not 100% fans of what the Federal Reserve has been doing.
Get in line.
And so there are questions about, were you too late? Did you get way behind the curve? And if so, why? And the other aspect of that is, when the Fed finally started, did you start too slowly? And then, of course, where did transitory come from and where did it go?
Yeah, so I've given about 4 speeches in the last 3 months on exactly this point. So on the transitory story last year, we had this kind of belief, and I gave speeches and I made these comments. So we all kind of thought, all forecasters, everybody, we had these supply shocks that caused prices to jack up. We know from simple econ, those things are going to unwind. And when that happens, prices will come back down. We had demand stimulus from fiscal policy, monetary policy, this excess saving. We thought once the stimulus is over, it's gone. Once monetary policy starts tightening, it's gone. Once people spend that excess saving, it's all gone. And then prices will come back down. And if you look at the inflation data for the monthly data starting about in May, every month, the monthly number was ticking down all the way to September. So the transitory story was holding until October of last year. And then inflation exploded. And it was at that point that we pivoted. We saw that the transitory story was not holding, and we pivoted as quickly as we could to getting our asset purchases ending, signaling rate hikes, and things like that. So like I said, I've talked about this in other speeches. On what affected us based on that was, I think from a risk management point of view, we didn't handle things right. I'll just blame myself, not necessarily all my colleagues. But we kind of bet the farm on this transitory story because that's what all the logic was telling us. From a risk management point of view, we should have been asking, but what if it doesn't come down? Right? We really believe it's, what about the state of the world that it doesn't come down? And in that case, you say, well, we need to start preparing to do tightening faster than we really believe we have to, but you got to prepare for it. So in my view, what we should have done from a risk management point of view is we should have started, and I started making these arguments last summer, we needed to get tapering started sooner. Because the sooner you start tapering, the sooner you can end it. and you can get rates up. And I think that was looking back, my own mind, my own error that was it.
Got a lot of great questions here. Let me combine a couple more here. One is, you said in your speech that you expect the economy to fall below potential, but get back to its potential after a couple of years. So the first part of the question is, what is potential? And second, we've had a lot of changes in the economy over the last 2 years because of COVID, especially. Are we going to go back to the same sort of inflation dynamics that we had? And does the Fed go back then to interest rates near zero for the long term? In other words, to use your boss's term, are we in a different kind of regime for the economy now?
Yeah, so on potential, in economic models, when you kind of solve these models and incorporate everybody's actions, everything, sort of long run growth comes out of productivity growth or technological change and labor market employment growth, which is really driven by population. So those are the two key drivers of potential growth. And those are things that are typically not affected by monetary policy or fiscal policy in any short run period of time. So if you look at productivity growth, labor force growth, those are the two big drivers of what your potential growth should be. Now those vary because productivity growth has been like 1 to 1.5% for the last 15, 20 years. Labor force growth, because of demographics, has been coming down. So estimates of potential range anywhere from about 1.5 to 2. I'm at the 2 view. I don't think it's come down that much. And I think productivity will come back up going forward. So that's on potential. What was the second half of the question?
The second half, well, there was one question about in terms of the potential inflation rate. The Fed looks at 2%, 3%, and longer-term inflation.
Yeah, this has been a lot of debate, like for years. So all through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the view was we had to figure out how to get inflation down and keep it down. That was the central banker's job. The view was we know how to create inflation. That's not it. We teach that in Econ 101. And then you hit the last decade, from 2010 till 2020, we could not get inflation up to 2%. This sounds crazy. I used to always joke, go get the guys from Argentina. They know how to do it. So the puzzle was we wanted 2%. It kept coming, underrunning it. And so the question was, there had to be some other structural kind of forces that were driving this down. And a couple things were demographics, China coming into the global trading system, productivity maybe not being as high as it had been in the past. So then the question is, I am a strong believer that in the end of the day, the 2% inflation is determined by Fed policy. And these other structural things affect it maybe up or down somewhat. But the Fed's choice of an inflation target really drives long-run inflation.
We've only got a few more minutes with Christopher Waller, who's a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. And there are a couple of questions about QT, which I know is a kind of a egghead thing, but the idea that you're shrinking your balance sheet, what impact is that having and will have on interest rates and on market liquidity? I mean, what is the collateral damage or collateral help that you get from shrinking the balance sheet?
Yeah, so when we were buying assets, kind of the idea was we were increasing the demand for these assets, pushing up their price, pushing down the yields. So it was more aimed at longer term rates because the short term rate was at 0. So to continue to try to provide some stimulus to the economy, we did QE. Logic tells you when you unwind that, rate should go back up. If they had any effect pushing them down, then the reverse should push them back up. The thing with balance sheet runoff is once we start raising rates, we don't want that to be our main policy tool because it's very brutish. We don't really know exactly how it's impacting. And most of the effects you get from balance sheet tightening is once you announce what you're going to do. As soon as you announce the path, the markets price it in immediately. And after that, you're just fulfilling those expectations. So it's not having any impact once you actually start doing it. Now, there are some liquidity things functioning in markets, market functioning where this may come in. But in terms of rates, anything that shows up in rates from QT should have been priced immediately once once we did it. And an example was Governor Brainerd gave a speech right before the minutes came out, telling, what our plans were for QT, and she kind of outlined what was going to be in the minutes. And 10-year rate jumped something like 34 basis points. Okay, that's what you would expect, right? You were pushing down longer term rates. She says, we're going to unwind it. Here's the path. The market completely priced it in within about a minute. I love that about financial markets. That's efficiency.
One person would like to know, and I'm sure many more would like to know your views on both crypto and the role of the Fed with a central bank digital currency.
Oh man, I could talk about this for hours. So crypto's been a fascinating world to watch. From monetary theory, which I'm a monetary theorist, I've done it for 30 years. The idea that you can create value out of an intrinsically useless object has been well known since 1958. We know how that works. It's a bubble. It could be a good bubble, but it's a bubble. And we know they can arise and they can last for a long time. So people always told me that all the crypto assets have to collapse to zero. I was like, no, they don't. There's nothing in theory that says that has to happen. They can sustain, they may crash. And when they crash spectacularly, which we saw happen a couple of weeks ago. So the crypto space to me it's like, yeah, it's kind of interesting more from the technology side than the economics of it. I guess that's what I never found it that interesting from an economics point of view. DeFi is a little different because this is actually doing finance in a way very different than the traditional financial sector. It's all pairwise. It's clearing and settlement instantly. It's all kind of code driven as opposed to human being driven. These are things that could end up transforming the traditional financial markets. So I see the DeFi world as much more fascinating in terms of what could happen in financial markets going forward. Crypto itself, I don't care. It's like baseball cards. I don't care about baseball cards either. So if people want to pay a lot of money for a baseball card, go ahead. I don't care.
All right, let me finish with one last question, and this will, in a way, serve to set up our next speaker. Politics and the Fed.
No.
The
Ixnay on the politics.
the first question is, and this came from the audience, if there was an excess of fiscal stimulus in the economy that has caused some of the inflation that we're seeing, when they were debating it in Congress and passing it, did you know that it was going to be too much? Did the Fed start worrying then? And then I just want to finish up by saying, this is an election year, and the November Fed meeting is less than a week before the election. Does that play any role in how the Fed looks at what it should do and when it should do it?
I mean, just from pure macroeconomic theory, the stimulus, which is what it was supposed to do, stimulated demand. We had very accommodative monetary policy. That was supposed to stimulate demand. A bunch of excess saving is going to stimulate demand. So that's just the economics of it. Whether it was too much, too little, should have been none at all, that ain't my job to talk about. So, but from the economic side, it fully is, these things had an impact. I'll stop it there. As far as the election, I ain't going to touch that one.
Well, we thank you very much for touching everything that you did touch today. Christopher Waller from the Federal Reserve Board, thank you very much.